friend just broke up with his wife and I stayed the weekend to support him, but when I got home, I want to start by saying if somebody told me that one weekend away will destroy everything that I've built, I would say, you are absolutely right, crazy. But here I am, with my marriage that is all but over, and my life as miserable as it can be. For starters, it began surprisingly my closest friend, Mark, had what could be described as the worst phase in his existence. He looked like a man on the edge because his wife left him for another man the previous week. I could not sit and watch him to be consumed by sorrow, and that was why I moved to his house during the weekend. What I did for him was the least I could offer him, considering the fact that he has been there for me most of the time. At first, everything seemed fine. I checked in with my husband Chris before I left, and he seemed okay with it, maybe a little distant, but nothing out of the ordinary. I thought I was doing the right thing, but the moment I came back home, everything felt wrong. Chris was cold, and the warmth we'd built in our relationship seemed to have disappeared overnight. I couldn't have imagined that one act of kindness would be the spark that would ignite the flames of everything falling apart. But it did, and now I'm left wondering how it all went so wrong. My name is Sarah. I am 26 years old, and I've been married to Chris for 4 years now. I remember that I had a strong feeling that we were made for each other when we were getting to know one another. He turned out to be the husband I had always dreamt of. He was caring, working, and very motivated in putting up a good life together. In the beginning of our union, he treated me as the most important person in his life. He would come home with things like balloons after work, or write me a love note and leave it on the fridge. Things like, "You can do it." There was a bond, like we stood hand in, therefore, we prepared to face any challenge as a team. But as time went on, things started to shift. Chris began focusing more on long-term goals, like saving for a house and planning for our future. I admired his dedication, but I started feeling like the present didn't matter as much to him anymore. He was obsessed with making everything perfect down the line, even if it meant cutting back on things that brought us joy now. One of the first signs that we weren't as happy as we ought to be was when Chris asked where and how I was spending money. He wasn't jealous initially, but he always made me feel that I was wrong for having fun. Going shopping with friends, or just buying something for myself, always evolved into a discussion of its necessity. He'd say, "It's not how much you earn, it's how clear you are on the goals ahead of you." Though I agreed with him, there were moments that it was quite oppressive. Chris's intentions were good. He wanted stability and security for our future family, but it was hard not to feel like he saw me as irresponsible. I began to resent the constant focus on what we shouldn't be doing and started longing for the carefree energy we had before. I wasn't perfect either. I know I pushed back more than I should have. But even then, I never doubted that we loved each other and could work through our differences. Mark, my best friend from college, rang me one day, informing me that his wife wanted a divorce. It took me a few seconds to respond. I first met Mark in college, and he stood by me at every stage of my life, good and bad. He seemed totally exhausted, and the idea of him suffering so much just made me want to dissolve in tears. I informed Chris on my decision to spend the weekend with Mark, and I expected him to be reasonable. But Chris's reaction wasn't what I expected. He wasn't outright angry, but I could tell he didn't like the idea. His questions about why Mark needed me and whether it was appropriate left me feeling defensive. I brushed off his concerns, chalking it up to irrational jealousy. Chris always worried too much, and I didn't think this was any different. I thought I was doing the right thing by being there for a friend. Looking back now, maybe I should have paid more attention to Chris's unease. But at the time, I couldn't see how this one decision would change everything. When I got to Mark's house, I began to appreciate the extent to which he was suffering. His neat, clean-shaven look was gone. His apartment was a wreck, and he looked weak, frail, and exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in days. A reliable friend who always had his life in order. Now Mark was standing in front, appearing lost, and unclear as to where to start with trying to fix his life. Mark's wife, Lisa, had blindsided him. After 10 years of marriage, he discovered that she'd been seeing someone else, a colleague at her office. When he confronted her, she didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she said she wasn't happy anymore, and that she had been feeling trapped in their marriage for years. The betrayal cut him deeply, and as he told me everything, his voice cracked several times. "I gave her everything, Sarah," Mark said while he was looking at the floor. "In the end, she willingly threw everything away from the life I provided for her and the man I was for someone else. He does not even understand what he was wrong about." Hearing the pain in his voice broke my heart. Mark had always been a kind, reliable person. He didn't deserve this. I wanted to say something comforting, but the truth is, I didn't know what to say. I tried to reassure him, telling him that he wasn't to blame, but it felt hollow, like nothing I said could make a difference. And throughout the weekend, we were able to spend hours discussing. This is what Mark said to me. "I sensed for the whole of last year Lisa wanting to turn away from me." She proceeded not to pay attention to conversations, went out a lot more often, and slowly drifted apart. It is worth noting that many of the examples she compiled were rather reminiscent of my own marriage. It was beginning to feel more and more like Chris and I, and as Mark painted a picture of how Lisa gradually became distant and icy, I recalled the distant coldness that was beginning to seep into my relationship with Chris. Mark's pain hit a nerve I didn't expect. I started wondering if Chris felt the same way about me, like I was slipping away, becoming someone he didn't recognize. It wasn't that I'd been unfaithful or that our marriage was falling apart like Mark's, but I couldn't deny that something felt off. Through the days of the weekend, Mark and I realized we are getting used to this pattern. We cooked together, cleaned up his apartment, and then watched some older movies to help him get his mind off things. It was familiar. I could almost say it was friendly. Like after all, we felt we are back to normal, like when we were just friends. One night, after a particularly emotional conversation, we stayed up late talking. The rain was pouring outside, and the apartment felt eerily quiet, except for the sound of the storm. Mark was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in his hand, and I was curled up in the armchair across from him. "I'm not sure I can do this, Sarah," he whispered. "I know that if I had to start over again, then it would feel like an impossibility." "You can," I said softly. "You're stronger than you think, Mark. You'll get through this." No. He suddenly locked eyes with me, and I felt this sudden weight, some kind of understanding that coursed through me and made me breathless. I couldn't tell whether it was the wine, the hour, or the openness we were at that moment sharing, but everything was slightly off. There was no objectification, no rude gestures, no sexual comments, but it was close enough to make me uncomfortable. I quickly stood up and started gathering the empty glasses. "It's late," I said, trying to break the tension. "We should get some sleep." This time, Mark simply nodded, and after that, his gaze remained on me for a little longer, before he stood up and went to his own room. To think freely and in peace, I got to the guest room, shut the door, and sat on the bed. Part of me wanted to disregard it as nothing, as a moment which arose from lack of sleep and the overwhelming feelings I had at the time. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I didn't feel guilty, at least. Not yet, but I did feel unsettled. I told myself I was just being a good friend, that I had done nothing wrong. Still, the thought of Chris popped into my mind. Would he see this as innocent? Would he understand why I felt the need to be here for Mark? The next day, I shrugged off the moment and tried to concentrate on what I need to do for Mark. The morning was mostly spent unpacking some of Lisa's things, which affected him more than I anticipated was going to happen. Once he came across an old honeymoon photograph of the two of them, and the crying resumed. I put my arms around him when his tears started, but when I tried to console, things were not the same. When the weekend finally ended, I hugged Mark goodbye and promised to check in on him. As I drove home, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that the weekend was over, guilt for feeling that way, and a lingering unease that I couldn't quite explain. I thought I'd done the right thing by being there for Mark, but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe I'd crossed a line, even if I didn't mean to. Sweeping the thought aside which tried to engulf me, I stepped into the driveway with the aim of only thinking and concentrating on Chris and our future. But at first I would feel that everything is fine and happy, but suddenly when I arrived home, I knew something was wrong. Chris was at the kitchen table, his face blank. And in that moment, the feeling of something wrong that I was experiencing turned into something much darker, into that sorrow I did not want to experience at all. When I walked through the door, I immediately sensed something was off. The house was too quiet. Chris was sitting at the kitchen table, his arms crossed, staring at the floor. He didn't look up when I came in. Normally, he would greet me with a hug, or at least a smile, but this time, there was nothing. Just silence. "Hello?" I greeted him a little too enthusiastically, my voice shaking just slightly. "I'm back." Chris finally looked up, his expression cold and unreadable. "How's Mark?" he asked, his tone flat. The question was completely unexpected. After thinking for a moment, I replied, "He's okay, I guess. Well, it has been a very difficult time for him, but I think he's going to get through it." Chris nodded slowly, still not breaking eye contact. "I bet it's been rough for him. Rough enough that you thought it was more important to be there for him than to be here." I could almost feel the narrowing of my throat when I heard his words. "Chris, you know why I went? Mark once again required someone, and I could not watch him struggle through everything by himself. You said you understood." "I said I understood," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "But did you even think about how I felt? Do you know how it felt to be here all weekend, wondering why you're prioritizing another man over your own husband?" I was trying to find words to say something in reaction, but no words came out of my mouth. The word betrayal left an almost palpable cloud over me and refused to be erased. "Chris, it wasn't like that," I said finally, trying to keep my voice calm. "Mark's my friend, you know that. He's been through so much, and I just wanted to help him." Chris then shook his head and laughed bitterly. "Help him? Don't you even know how this looks? You leave all responsibilities behind just to be with him for 2 whole days, and I am allowed to be fine with that? It's not about appearances," I snapped, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Mark needed me. I wasn't going to let him down just because you're insecure about it." "Insecure?" Chris fired back, namely stood up from the table. "And what do you think this is, insecurity? This is about respect. This is about the fact that for months now, you've been physically distancing yourself from me, and I begin feeling like you don't see me half the time. And now you're running off to play savior for someone else?" His words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I crossed my arms, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "You're overreacting, Chris. Nothing happened, and you know it." "Do I?" he said softly, though there was still an edge to his words. "Do I really know that? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you've already withdrawn from this marriage a long time ago." I froze, unable to respond. Deep down, I knew there was some truth to what he was saying, but I wasn't ready to face it, not yet. Instead, I defaulted to defensiveness. "You cannot be serious. That is unfair," I protested. "What are you turning this into, or making this? What do you want to transform this into now? I've been here, Chris. I've been trying." "Have you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Because it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you're here physically, but mentally, you're somewhere else entirely. And this weekend just proved it." I catch the guilt that I have been trying to deny for days now, but instead of acknowledging it, I worked hard to hide it from him. "What do you expect me to tell you?" I sighed, anguished, putting my back towards him. "I want you to be honest with me," Chris said, his voice firm. "Why does it feel like I'm the only one fighting for this marriage? Why does it feel like you've already given up?" My hands were in tight fists, and there were tears welling within my eyes. "Well, that's not true," I replied, though deep within I was unsure if what I said was actually true. "I'm trying, Chris. I really am." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't see it, do you? You don't see how distant you've been. You don't see how much it's hurting me. And now you expect me to believe that spending the weekend with another man was just about being a good friend?" "It was about being a good friend," I said, my voice rising. "Mark needed me. I wasn't going to abandon him." "And what about me?" Chris shot back. "Do I not need you? Do I not deserve your support, your time, your attention? Or is that reserved for everyone but me?" The room fell silent, his words hanging heavy in the air. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I hadn't meant to make him feel this way, but the truth was, I didn't have an answer. Chris finally broke the silence. I don't know what's happening between us, Sarah, but it's not working. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're right. Maybe this marriage isn't as important to you as it is to me. Without another word, he walked past me and headed to the bedroom, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen. I felt a mix of anger, guilt, and sadness swirling inside me, but I couldn't bring myself to follow him. Instead, I stayed there, staring at the empty table, wondering how everything had spiraled so far out of control. The tension between Chris and me had been growing ever since I came back from Mark's place. Every conversation felt strained. Every glance was loaded with unspoken accusations. I tried to act like everything was fine, like we could sweep our problems under the rug and move on, but Chris wasn't letting it go. One evening after dinner, it all came to a head. Chris was unusually quiet, barely touching his food. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, like he was trying to hold back whatever he wanted to say. I finally broke the silence. Are we really going to sit here and pretend nothing's wrong? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Chris looked up, his expression cold. I think the real question is, are you going to keep pretending nothing's wrong? I felt my stomach drop. What's that supposed to mean? You know exactly what it means, he snapped, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. You've been distant for months, Sarah. You barely talk to me anymore. You shut me out, and now you expect me to believe that spending the weekend with another man was completely innocent? His words stung, and I felt anger bubbling up inside me. Mark is my friend, Chris. I've told you this 100 times. Why can't you just trust me? Trust you? He repeated, his voice rising. How am I supposed to trust you when you prioritize someone else over your own husband? When you disappear for an entire weekend and act like I'm the one with the problem? I was helping a friend, I shouted, standing up from the table. Mark was going through something horrible, and I was just trying to be there for him. Why is that so hard for you to understand? Chris stood up too, his face inches from mine. Because it's not just about the weekend, Sarah. It's about everything. You don't see it, but you've been pulling away from me for months. And now I'm supposed to believe there's nothing going on with Mark? Do you even care how that makes me feel? I felt my throat tighten, but I refused to cry in front of him. This isn't about Mark, I said through gritted teeth. This is about you trying to control everything I do. You're the one who's been pushing me away, Chris, not the other way around. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he might yell back, but instead, he let out a bitter laugh. You know what? Maybe I am the problem. Maybe I'm the fool for thinking you still care about this marriage. Those words cut deeper than I expected, but instead of softening, I hardened. You're unbelievable, I said, grabbing my coat. I'm done having this conversation. Where are you going? He demanded. Out! I snapped, slamming the door behind me before he could say another word. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to get out of that house, away from Chris and his relentless accusations. My feet carried me to the one place I knew I'd be welcome in Mark's apartment. When I knocked on his door, Mark opened it, looking surprised but not unhappy to see me. Sarah, what are you doing here? I needed to get out of the house, I said, my voice trembling. Chris and I had a fight. He stepped aside, letting me in. You look like you could use a drink, he said, gesturing to the couch. I sat down, feeling the weight of the evening settle over me. Mark poured me a glass of wine, and we started talking. At first it was about Chris and our argument, but the conversation quickly turned to Mark's own struggles. I don't know how you do it, I said at one point, my voice thick with emotion. You've been through so much, and you're still standing. I feel like I'm falling apart. Mark gave me a sad smile. You're stronger than you think, Sarah. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. There was something in the way he said it, the way he looked at me, that made my heart race. It wasn't just comfort. It felt like something more. I don't know what I'm doing anymore, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. Mark reached out, placing a hand on mine. You're just trying to find your way, he said softly. At that moment, the lines blurred. I didn't think about Chris or the consequences. I didn't think about anything. I leaned in, and Mark didn't pull away. What happened next was impulsive and reckless. It wasn't planned and it wasn't right, but it happened. I crossed a line I never thought I'd cross, and the weight of it hit me the moment it was over. I pulled away, my breath shaky. I shouldn't have. I need to go, I said, grabbing my coat and stumbling toward the door. Sarah, wait, Mark called after me, but I didn't stop. The drive home was a blur. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Guilt washed over me in waves, each one stronger than the last. How could I face Chris after what I'd just done? How could I even look him in the eye? When I got home, the house was dark. Chris was already in bed, and for the first time, I was grateful for the silence. I slipped into the guest room, unable to bear the thought of lying next to him. As I lay there in the darkness, the reality of what I'd done began to sink in. I'd betrayed Chris in the worst way possible, and no matter how much I tried to justify it to myself in the moment, there was no undoing what had happened. The guilt was suffocating, but it was nothing compared to the dread of what would happen when Chris found out. Because deep down, I knew secrets like this never stay buried for long. I thought I could bury what had happened with Mark, but guilt has a way of surfacing in the most unexpected ways. I tried to act normal, but everything about me must have screamed guilt. My nervousness, my refusal to make eye contact, the way I avoided Chris's touch. Chris wasn't stupid. He knew something was off, even if he didn't know what it was yet. It all came to a head one evening when Chris came home early from work. I was in the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the weight of my own thoughts. He walked in, looked at me, and then said something that made my blood run cold. "Who's Mark texting you at this hour?" he asked, his voice sharp. I froze, my mind racing. I hadn't realized Mark had messaged me earlier, and I hadn't cleared the notification from my lock screen. Chris had clearly seen it. "It's nothing," I said quickly, shoving my phone into my pocket. Chris's eyes narrowed. "Nothing? You've been acting weird ever since you came back from his place? You avoid me, you barely talk to me, and now you're getting texts from him late at night? What's going on, Sarah?" "Nothing is going on," I insisted, my voice cracking. Chris wasn't buying it. He stepped closer, his voice rising. "Don't lie to me. I've been patient. I've tried to trust you, but this doesn't add up. Did something happen with Mark?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to find a way to deflect, but I was running out of excuses. "Chris, you're overthinking this," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "Mark and I are just friends. That's all." "Friends don't act like this," Chris snapped. "Friends don't make you avoid your husband. Friends don't send you texts that make you look like you've seen a ghost. What aren't you telling me, Sarah?" I could see the anger and hurt in his eyes, and it felt like the walls were closing in. I knew I couldn't lie my way out of this, but I wasn't ready to tell the truth either. "Chris, please, can we not do this right now?" I said, trying to walk past him, but he grabbed my arm, his grip firm but not painful. "No, Sarah, we're doing this right now. What happened?" I looked at him, my chest tightening as the words I'd been dreading finally spilled out. "I made a mistake," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Chris's face fell, his anger momentarily replaced by shock. "What kind of mistake?" he asked, though I could see in his eyes that he already knew. Tears streamed down my face as I choked out the words. "It was just one time. I didn't mean for it to happen. I was upset, and I wasn't thinking." "You weren't thinking?" Chris shouted, his voice filled with fury. "You weren't thinking when you betrayed me? When you threw everything we've built away?" "I'm sorry," I sobbed, reaching for him, but he stepped back like my touch burned him. "Sorry?" he spat. "You're sorry? You think that fixes this? Do you even understand what you've done, Sarah? Do you know how much I trusted you, how much I fought for us? And this is how you repay me?" I tried to explain, to make him see that it wasn't about him, that it was my own weakness, my own mistake, but every word I said only seemed to make things worse. "You don't get to blame this on your emotions or a bad night," Chris said, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and despair. "You made a choice. You chose to betray me. You chose to ruin us." "I didn't mean to hurt you," I said desperately. "Well, congratulations," he said bitterly, "because you've done just that." He turned away, pacing the room like he didn't know what to do with himself. Then, after a long silence, he looked back at me, and I could see the resolve in his eyes. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice low but firm. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart sinking. "I mean this marriage is over," he said, his words like a dagger to my chest. "I can't stay with someone who doesn't respect me, who doesn't value what we've built. I deserve better than this." "Chris, please," I begged, reaching for him again. "We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Please don't give up on us." But he shook his head. "You already gave up on us, Sarah. The moment you chose someone else over me, you ended this marriage. I just didn't realize it until now." He walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, broken and alone. The weight of what I'd done crashed down on me all at once. I had destroyed the one thing I thought was unshakable, and there was no going back. At that moment, I knew I had lost Chris forever. And the worst part, I had no one to blame but myself. The days after Chris walked out felt like a blur. At first, I held on to a sliver of hope that he would cool down and we could talk things through. I sent him texts, left voicemails, and even drove by his office once, hoping to catch him for just a few minutes. But every attempt was met with silence. Chris wasn't just angry he was done. The reality hit me hard when I received the divorce papers a week later. My heart sank as I read the words on the page. It wasn't just a threat or a moment of anger. Chris was serious about ending our marriage. I tried to reach out one last time, begging him to meet with me so we could talk. But his response was clear and final. "There's nothing to talk about, Sarah. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. The man who had once loved me more than anything now wanted nothing to do with me. I couldn't believe it was over, just like that. As the divorce process moved forward, the cracks in my life started to widen. Friends I thought I could lean on began to pull away. Some didn't want to get involved, and others clearly sided with Chris. It wasn't long before I noticed the judgment in their eyes, the whispers behind my back. Even the friends who didn't say anything outright stopped calling, stopped inviting me to things. The loneliness was crushing. I'd always thought of myself as independent, someone who could handle anything life threw at me. But now, without Chris, and without the support of my friends, I felt completely lost. The walls of my apartment, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and suffocating. I had plenty of time to think, really. And with every passing day, the weight of my actions pressed down on me harder. I replayed every argument with Chris, every moment of tension, and most painfully, that night with Mark. What had I been thinking? How could I have let things spiral so far out of control? The worst part was knowing that Chris had been right. I had pulled away from him. I had let my frustrations and selfishness cloud my judgment. Instead of working through our problems, I'd chosen the easy way out, and it had cost me everything. One afternoon, I saw a photo on social media that stopped me in my tracks. It was Chris, smiling, surrounded by a group of friends at a barbecue. He looked truly happy. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief, thinking maybe he was doing okay. But that relief quickly turned into a deep, aching pain. He was moving on, building a new life without me. And here I was, stuck in the mess I'd created. I started to understand that I wasn't just mourning the loss of Chris. I was mourning the life we had planned together, the home we wanted to buy, the vacations we talked about, the future that now seemed so far out of reach. I had taken it all for granted, and now it was gone. The isolation became unbearable. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything over and over again in my mind. I wanted to believe that things would get better, that I could rebuild my life, but I didn't know where to start. The loneliness, the guilt, and the regret felt like they were swallowing me whole. I realized too late that some mistakes can't be undone. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Chris had been my anchor, and without him, I was adrift. The life I had taken for granted was gone, and the emptiness it left behind was a constant reminder of how far I had fallen. And the cruelest part? I had no one to blame but myself. Update. It's been 6 months since the divorce was finalized, but it feels like a lifetime. Chris has moved on so effortlessly, it seems. I see glimpses of his new life through mutual friends or social media. He's thriving, and it's clear that he's happier without me. The hardest part was seeing a picture of him with someone new. She looked radiant, standing next to him with a smile that mirrored his. They looked like they belonged together, like she fit into the life I was supposed to share with him. I couldn't help but wonder if she was everything I wasn't understanding, supportive, unbroken. It was a painful reminder of how far I had fallen in his eyes. I've spent countless nights replaying everything in my mind, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when I lost him. Was it when I started pulling away emotionally? When do I put my frustrations ahead of our relationship? Or was it that single reckless choice that shattered everything? The truth is, it doesn't matter anymore. I can't undo what I've done. I thought I was justified in supporting my friend, but I let my emotions and selfishness cloud my judgment. I lost sight of what truly mattered, and in the end, I pushed Chris away when he was the one person who always stood by me. I see now that Chris wasn't perfect, but neither was I. He fought for our marriage until the very end, and I didn't. I let resentment fester, and I made choices that I'll regret for the rest of my life. Life after Chris has been empty. I've tried to pick up the pieces, but it's hard when everything reminds me of what I had and lost. The apartment feels too quiet, and the friends I thought would always be there have drifted away. I used to think I was strong enough to handle anything, but losing Chris has shown me just how fragile I really am. The worst part is knowing he's living the life we once planned together, just not with me. The house we dreamed of, the future we talked about, the love we were supposed to share, it's all his now, but I'm not part of it, and I have no one to blame but myself. If I could go back, I'd do everything differently. I'd listen more, fight harder, and appreciate what I had before it was too late. But life doesn't work that way. Some mistakes leave scars that never fade, and some losses can never be undone. I thought supporting my friend was the right thing to do, but I ended up losing everything I cared about. Now, all I can do is live with the pain I created and hope that someday I'll find a way to forgive myself, even if Chris never could.